Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 61 of the Future of Work show, where we discuss ideas that are changing the world of work. I'm super excited about this episode because it's the start of a limited series on AI and culture. Now, for those of you who've been following us, this is the third limited series we're doing. Last year, we did one on second careers. We spoke to several people who had gone on to do very interesting career switches to understand their journey a little bit. We'd also spoken to academics to understand what are some of those areas where, if you're considering a second career, you should be conscious of. Uh, Earlier this year, we did a limited series on diversity, and we explored several aspects of diversity that hadn't perhaps received as much attention. And this is our third limited series, and it's on AI and culture. Now, to be honest, one of the reasons I'm super excited about this is that me and my research colleague Jaspreet Bintra are independently researching this area. For the last several months, we have been studying organizations that are ahead of the curve in their respective industry to understand what culturally allows them to be ahead of the curve. And we're coming up with some very interesting findings. If this is a topic that's of interest to you, do subscribe to my newsletter called Eyeing the Future. We have over 85,000 subscribers now, so thank you so much. Really deeply honored. Now, the main interview is actually pre-recorded because of time zone difficulties. Professor Ransbotham is in Boston. So what I will do is I'm going to be here backstage while the interview plays. Do keep your questions coming. I will do my best to answer the questions as much as I can. And as I said, this is a topic where we have an independent subject matter expertise as well. So we'll be absolutely thrilled to share some of what we know. With that, let me just get started. Everyone, welcome to episode 61 of the Future of Work show. For those of you who've been following us, you know that on the Future of Work show, we discuss ideas that are changing the world. And we've had several eminent academics, practitioners, and thought leaders on this show over the last few years. Today is the first of a series of 6 episodes that we're going to be doing about AI and culture. And I'm super excited about this because my research colleague Jaspreet Bindra and I are doing our own set of independent research on what's the impact of organizational culture on the deployment of AI. So imagine my thrill when I discovered that there have been a few very interesting and very credible studies on this topic earlier. And today I have with me a very special guest, Professor Sam Ransbotham, who is a professor of analytics at the Boston College, a guest editor for MIT's Sloan Management Review, and in fact, the podcast host of MIT's own podcast on AI in business, Me, Myself, and AI. So let me welcome Sam onto the show. Hi, Sam.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So delighted, so delighted. And, as I was just telling our viewers, I was so happy to come across your research and then I reached out to you. So imagine my delight when you accepted the invitation. Uh,
Well, it's not hard. It's always fun to talk about what you're working on. So,
True, true, true. Sam, so you were one of the early people to study. You've studied many technologies, but AI and its impact on organizations and organizations' culture. How does that impact their ability to deploy artificial intelligence platforms and tools? Before we start any of the main episode, I'm just curious what got you interested in this as a subject.
gosh, I'm not sure how far back to go, but it starts a while back. I'm gonna go back to my PhD dissertation, and in my dissertation, I was analyzing computer security. And part of computer security is a bunch of log files, and those log files have millions, almost billions of records in them. But buried in there, somewhere in the log file, is bad stuff. Now, the problem is there's so much haystack, there's so much normal behavior within that log that it's really difficult to figure out what you want to focus on. And with that, I got super interested in the analytical techniques to do that analysis. And then from there, I kind of said, well, hey, that works for computer security and it works for all kinds of different things. And so from there, it began to evolve. So that's the quick summary of it. And of course, I can talk about that for forever, but that's where the beginning was.
That's super exciting. And, one of the organizations as part of our research project is a consulting organization, which in fact has a cybersecurity practice. And they were one of the early adopters of AI tools and techniques, pretty much for the reasons that, you spoke about. It just made so much sense.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah,
so
it's a
powerful.
situation when there's so much data, which you need a lot of data for AI, and there's so much data there. But it's also the kind of thing you need really quick reaction times. You can't say, well, maybe this is bad behavior. We'll stop it. We'll look into it next week and get back to you. And these things are happening in real time. And that's a very demanding world.
I can imagine. So, Sam, I'm going to start with a question I've heard you ask some of your podcasts.
Oh, no, that's not fair.
Which is, you've been studying, of course, analytics, technologies, different forms of technologies. How much of a game changer really is AI?
Well, yeah. See, I always guess that question because it's really hard to answer that because it's really hard to know the future. There's the classic Ray Amara quote, which is, "We tend to overestimate how a technology is going to change things in the short term, but we tend to underestimate how it's going to affect things in the long term." And I think that's probably where we are with artificial intelligence. It is not hard right now to read any of a dozen stories every day. It's really kind of exhausting how much content is coming out every day. And they tend to have two flavors. There's either breathless hype that this technology is going to change everything and make the world wonderful, or that the technology is going to destroy everything and we're going to be back in the caves. There doesn't seem to be any middle ground yet. And so, I think that's what's interesting is where we're going to end up somewhere between those. I think in the long run, it's pretty amazing. If you think about the rate of change that we've had just over the last, I don't know, actually just the last 500 days with the large language models, I mean, that's a crazy amount of progress. But on the other hand, it's also tempting to extrapolate and to do a linear extrapolation. And I think that's flawed as well, because if we extrapolate linearly, it thinks, well, we're going to make the same progress over the last 500 days we've made in the last one. But that's not exactly how technologies tend to work. They tend to be fits and starts, and we tend to work on the easier things first, and these get done, and then the next things are harder. And so that really speaks to a more asymptotic or logarithmic approach to progress. But where we are on that curve is really hard to figure out.
So well said. But would you expect increasing returns to scale to this technology?
Well, I think that's really interesting because actually, let's take a specific technology rather than general. If you think about image processing, so I don't know if you're familiar, your listeners are familiar with the ImageNet competition, but the idea with ImageNet was that they made a competition and they had 14 plus million labeled images. And when they had that many images, people were able to do some amazing things. But 14 million labeled images is actually a lot of data. And so it takes a fair amount of images to get to that point. And I'm afraid that in a lot of other contexts, we don't have that much data. One of the counterexamples is that, well, I'm careful how much you talk about this, but if we think about trying to make executive decisions about, for example, mergers and acquisitions, you have nowhere near 14 million observations of mergers and acquisitions to work with. And so I think, in those particular cases, it's going to be really hard to figure out where we are on that curve. I think on that one, we're way with insufficient data. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this idea of the curse of dimensionality. When you got more things to explain what's going on than you do observations, your model is going to perform poorly. On the other hand, if you have a ton of observations and very few things that can affect the model, then you're going to perform really well. So as we try to attack bigger questions that have a lot more potential influences, we're going to need a lot more data. But unfortunately, for a lot of those, we don't have data.
That's
It's
so
tough.
interesting. interesting. I wasn't aware of this, and so interesting. And what you're saying sort of makes sense. So your ability to make predictions or have insights is so much greater when the number of variables, if I understand what you're saying, are fewer,
Yep.
which is not the case when you're modeling any complex decision, really.
Exactly. When stuff gets complicated, things that make things complicated are the number of factors that can go into it. And when you have that, you just need a lot of observations. Luckily, more observations we have.
Makes a lot of sense to me. So thank
But
you for
again,
that.
sorry, actually, one more point there. Sorry to just
Yeah,
keep going
yeah,
on that,
sure,
because
please.
that's one of the reasons I think people are so excited about these generative adversarial models, for example. If we wanted to, well, think about driving, and I hate that everything always comes back to driving, but it's an example that people think about. In your life, you drive, and there'll probably be a total of maybe 30 seconds in your entire life where you have a critical moment that you make a life or death decision while driving. You just don't have that many chances. Fortunately, I mean, it's a good thing you don't have many chances to practice that. But we want, for example, automation to be able to practice those things. And that's nice about these adversarial networks, is that we can put machines in situations and test them without having real humans at risk. And we have the ability to learn in that situation, which I'm very excited about. We can practice things that we never could have practiced before. That's exciting.
It's super exciting, and I'm actually going to come to that later in our
Whoops.
conversation about
Okay. Sorry. Didn't mean to jump ahead.
how do we learn using AI, because I can see how it might potentially connect. So I'm
Yes, it
definitely going
does.
to pick your brains on that. So I'm going to start off with, Sam, one of your studies in collaboration with BCG on
Mhm.
the role that organizational culture plays in the deployment of AI, and then in turn how organizations that are successful in AI, deployment are impacted in their culture and how I'd love to hear in that virtuous cycle.
Yeah. So I think it's really natural if you think about artificial intelligence. Maybe your first question is, hey, what will the monetary benefits be, or how can we improve efficiency? And those make a lot of sense, and I think those are super important. I'm not negating those in any way, but what we got interested in is some of these other effects of artificial intelligence. So when people put artificial intelligence in an organization, okay, it may have some financial aspects, it may have some sufficiency or decision making quality, but what else? And so that's when we got interested in culture. When we started looking at culture, we asked people some questions. We do this typically through a combination of a global survey. We usually get 3,000 or 4,000 responses across the globe, and then we'll do interviews as well. And when we started talking about it, what we found is that there are some effects of using artificial intelligence that monetary and actual dollars don't capture real well. And so let me just pick on one: team morale. We fortunately had the, I don't know where it came from. I'm not going to take credit for it. Someone on our team thought about, hey, let's ask people how their morale has changed through the use of artificial intelligence. And we were stunned at how much difference using artificial intelligence could make. Because you might think, well, people are sad because they're machines, they have to deal with machines all the time, or they're sad because their work has changed, but that's not at all what we found. And so what we found was something like team culture through collective learning, or clarity of roles is another one we looked at, or collaboration, morale. All these things seem to improve when people started using artificial intelligence. And what's interesting to us about that is that when that culture improves, then people wanted to use more AI. If this is making me happier, then hey, maybe I want to do more of it. I mean, it's a natural thing. So then people do more. And then when they did more, they found that, well, things were more effective, things work smoother. And so then when things are working smoother and more effective, well, then culture improved. And so it became this cycle of improvement that each one of these steps led to more improvement of the other step. Now, it is by I don't mean to imply that it's all easy and that, for example, if you do a terrible AI implementation, then it certainly doesn't improve morale and it doesn't make people want to do more. So the point of the cycle is not that it has to always happen progressively and positively, but that there is a cycle. These are all interrelated.
That's actually so interesting to me because I mean, if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that when an AI project is deployed well, the fact that people can do things easier, better, more insightfully than they could earlier is the driving factor for the increase in morale, collaborative learning, and I think you speak about clarity of roles.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So all that comes because people can now do things they couldn't do earlier. Is that right?
And they can do things they couldn't do earlier, or they're not having to do things they don't want to do. And if you think about, I mean, there's a lot of hoopla. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to that today. There's a lot of hoopla about machines taking over for people and their jobs. But deep down, there's a lot of our jobs that we don't actually want to be doing every day. We
Very true.
I mean, I don't want to share too many personal anecdotes here, but I teach a lot of classes, and most interactions with students are wonderful. But some of them are just asking me questions that are in the syllabus, and I get a little bit bored with that. And so, that's a place where using technologies can free me from doing something that I don't want to do, or make it faster or more efficient, and that makes me happier. Then I can do the stuff I want to do. And so that's the general, mechanism, I think, behind this.
That's so interesting because just a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft, released its workplace report 2024. And in that report, so many employees speak about how they use it at a personal level, but very often their organizations aren't aware of it because somewhere, unless they're working in an organization which very actively speaks about deploying these tools, it's almost they're a little embarrassed to share that they are using these tools, in fact, to make their work easier. So that was super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe, I think there's an element of this technology that is very subtle. And so one of the things that we did last year was we asked people, how much are you using AI in your job? And 66% of those people said that they were using it not at all or minimally, which I found kind of interesting. 2/3 of the people are not doing that. But then when we started to ask them about actual things they used, well, 44% of those, so almost half of those people who said that they didn't use it at all, came back and said, oh, no, what? I do that. I mean, I didn't realize we were talking about that. And so what's happening is this technology is creeping into workplaces. And there's the whole Arthur C. Clarke quote, which is anything sufficiently advanced looks like magic. Maybe the converse of that is
I love that quote. I really love it. So true.
Well, think about the opposite, though. Like anything that we can do right now can't possibly be artificial intelligence, right? Because we can do it. Artificial intelligence is supposed to be some magical thing. And if we can do it right now, then it's probably couldn't possibly be AI. And so I ask people, are they using artificial intelligence? And they'll tell me no. They'll tell me no while they're using Zoom with a blurred background. They'll tell me no while they just unlock their phone with facial ID. But those things don't count, right? And I'm not sure they should count. So it's a little tricky because when we think about artificial intelligence, there's a mindset we go to immediately a humanoid looking robot that acts like a human. And I think those are fascinating, but that's not exactly what's happening everywhere. I mean, a lot of the uses of artificial intelligence are incredibly boring right now. It's getting you from point A to point B in a routing algorithm just a little bit faster. It's nothing amazing, and it's not even anything you see. One of the things that we did in our report was we interviewed people, and like one of the interviews we did was with a woman named Fiona Tan, and she was the chief technology officer of Wayfair, which is a furniture company. And I liked one of the things she said. She said, it's not like people come into work every day and think, hey, I'm going to use some artificial intelligence. No, they want to get their job done. What's happening is that increasingly parts of jobs touch on or use artificial intelligence. And so that from that perspective, it's quite pervasive.
You know, and that makes so much sense. One of the observations which a senior leader, shared a few weeks ago was how he's seen everybody's email language improve ever since ChatGPT got introduced.
Beautiful, beautiful example. That's a perfect one.
Such a
Thank
good
you.
example. Yeah, yeah.
But
I
if you
mean,
think back, if you go back in time, if someone, analogy I like to make is if you went back 200 years ago and you're using a writing quill and the ink turned red in your writing quill when you misspelled a word, that would be magic, right? That would be amazing. But that's just spell check, right? That's not AI. That's boring. Grammar check, is that AI? That's boring. So what's happened is that we're increasingly parts of these technologies are just influenced, they're embedded in all the other things we do, like writing an email. And then overall the quality gets better.
and since you said that when people, the moment they hear AI, they have an image of a humanoid. Let me tell you, I use Mid-Journey a lot
Mm-hmm.
for the art I create, for all my work presentations. And the moment I ask Mid-Journey to generate an image with AI, it does give me a humanoid image.
Exactly.
That is the image that comes up. So it's really no surprise.
Right. And so much of those technologies, so much of these generative technologies, and I think this touches on a negative thing, which is when we use these generative technologies and they give us the result that we expect, we feel like they're correct. So, for example, you ask it for an example of artificial intelligence. Well, and it gives you a humanoid robot, and you say, "Oh, that's great. It works. It fits like it works." But then, what gets trickier is you ask it for an image of a doctor, and it shows a white man. And does that reinforce these stereotypes that we have in our society? And I think that's what's especially tricky is when so much of this is working towards an average versus ignoring these outliers.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that's one of our dangers here.
absolutely. And I think, that's actually a whole other conversation, responsible AI. How does ethics flow into our use of AI platforms? It's a huge subject. And I'm glad you brought it up because it's just that's how important it is. So I'm going to come back to the study, Sam.
Mhm.
One of the things I'm curious about is whether you discovered anything about the organizational cultures that were going to implement AI projects more easily.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective. I mean, one of the things that we try to pay attention to when we're doing research is there's a set of factors that are associated with more AI use. Now, for example, it could be that a big company and a small company behave differently. But to me, that's less interesting because you cannot control whether or not your company is big or not. Maybe an interesting fact, but it's not under managerial
Yeah.
control. So, or industry, there may be different industry effects. Some industries are, the technology industries are much more interested in using these technologies than maybe human resources, for example. But the trick is that people can't control that. So then what are the things under people's control? And so one of the things that we looked at was project selection and their attitude towards risk, because that's something you can control. And so what we found is that AI people who are doing more artificial intelligence type projects successfully are people who are taking slightly more risk. They're doing a more projects, which is letting them, and again, tying to I think where you're going with this, tying them towards organizational learning. That they are using these experiments, these small projects here and there, to learn more about how the technologies work and where it may fit, versus maybe a huge monolithic big project that does one massive thing well, but ignores everything else. I don't know
Actually,
if you go
no,
ahead.
no, I agree. I agree. That is actually something we're also discovering in the research
Okay.
that we are finding that there are some belief systems in organizations that are more conducive to them
Hmm.
being ahead of the curve. And, that has things like just a fundamental belief that, yeah, tech will offer the next solution. There
Mm-hmm.
is a better way to do this. Faith in the insights that can come potentially from data, sort of familiarity with how to use data, the capacity and desire to experiment on small projects, pilot them quickly, learn from them. So, we are, it's early stages as yet, and I know much may change, but we are discovering that there are some beliefs that seem to, uh, come up time and again and seem to be linked with the front runners in, implementing AI in the organizations.
Well, maybe we
So,
should talk to more about that, because that's something that we're actively looking at for this year's report. Historically, we've done some research about how the use of organizational learning affects artificial intelligence, but we're also curious about the reverse of that, and I think that's what we're studying right now. So I'd be curious, maybe offline, we
yeah,
can talk
yeah,
about that.
absolutely, absolutely. And with that, I want to jump into that, the relationship between organizational learning and AI projects. And I know that in another study of yours, I think that was also in collaboration with BCG, you
Yep.
write about
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yep.
Could you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really what, if you think about how the world is working, most of the things that we're interested in, that we're talking about, are knowledge work. And so it's not to say that there's not use of artificial intelligence for manufacturing and for all sorts of other things, but what's really interesting over the last 500 days or so has been this interrelationship between artificial intelligence and stuff that we used to not be able to do, like knowledge work, like writing, like synthesizing, like understanding. And so when you start thinking about those things, those are inherently tied to learning and what we know, what we don't know, knowing what we know, knowing what we don't know. I think that's very fascinating, and I think that's actually something we're really going deeper on this year.
Wow. Wow. Sam, do you think we can learn as humans, we can learn something from artificial intelligence on how to learn better?
Oh gosh, yes. You set me up for that. I think I'm very excited about that. I think so. When people talk about artificial intelligence, one of the first things I think, much like people jump to an image of a humanoid robot, things that looks like a human. The other thing we think about is how we can teach the machines to do something, and I think that's a big deal. And I mentioned earlier the idea of ImageNet. So ImageNet was a contest where we took 14 million plus images, and they had a contest to see who could build the best algorithm. 2012, the group out of Toronto started the deep learning approaches with the computational power and the mimicking the human brain, and saw rapid improvements. Well, I should have looked this up before we talked, but the error rates for the machine right now are something like 3 to 4%. The error rates for human in the same thing are about 5%. So what we have here is that our role of human teaching machine to do something may not really work anymore if the machine can do it better than us. One of the things that people, whenever you talk about artificial intelligence, you have to mention the Turing test. It's almost a requirement. And the Turing test is, can you tell the difference between a human and a machine? And the answer, I think, is increasingly yes, you can tell a difference between a human and a machine, because the machine works better, right? If you said, all right, analyze 10,000 potentially fraudulent credit card transactions, and the answer came back in 10 seconds, you'd know it was a machine versus knowing it was versus a human. And so that's a case where we're not necessarily in this role of teacher anymore. And I think when you think about machine learning, it's not so much about the machine learning as what we can learn from the machines or with the machines. And I think with the machines is pretty exciting. One of the things that academically I've been working on, and this is with Eric Bogert and Aaron Schechter at one's at Northeastern, the other's University of Georgia. We've been looking at how people learn chess. So we've examined how people have learned to play chess over about a decade. Some of those people use AI tools to try to improve their knowledge of chess. And I'm not talking about using AI to play chess. What I'm talking about, like if that's sort of what they call centaur chess, where it's a human plus a machine playing together. I'm just talking about a human, for example, playing against a machine or getting feedback from a machine about how they play well and how they later on play against a human. Because most people play chess as a recreational activity. They want to get better themselves. The goal is not to win. The goal is to win, but the goal is not to win that particular game. The goal is to understand how to play better, to get to be a better player. And so what we've found in our research is a great relationship between the four components of experiential learning and how those relate to people's improvement. So if they use artificial intelligence to address these four ways of experiential learning, they get to be better chess players. But it's not uniform. If you think about beginning chess players have a very different set of activities that help them than advanced chess players. Or there's chess games that are short games and long games. Those have very different benefits from AI.
Sam, so will you speak a little bit about those four ways to learn experientially, just so that I have some sense of.
Oh, okay. So, there's a learning theory. We're not the first people to think about learning, of course. There are a lot of people have done a lot of research on learning and know more about it than I do. But there are four ways that we learn through experience. And so one is concrete experience. So concrete experience. So this is just like you could, for example, play against the chess machine. And so that just gives you more repetitions in playing chess. So you gain experience. But that's not the only way. So another way that people learn is through reflective observation. So sitting back and thinking about what's happened and how, did this work? Did this not work? And it turns out machines are really good at helping with that. So for example, you can make a play and the machine right then can tell you, that wasn't a great play. There's a slightly better play. Do you want to try it? And so what you can do then is not go through a whole chess game, lose, win, and then come back later and study it. You can in real time understand how the micro components of what you're doing make a difference. And so that's another way that we can learn. A different way is abstract conceptualization. So there are, for example, moves in chess that you can do that require an understanding of the pieces. And so there are different ways that you can set up a chess game rather than the normal chess, which is give everybody 12 queens or give everybody 6 kings. There's just all kinds of different variations. And each one of those can sort of practice a different mental skill. It helps you understand how the pieces work together. And so that's a different way of learning. So that's the third one. And then finally, what we've seen is that doing, for example, chess puzzles can help. So what that does is puts you in an experimental situation where you can play. You can try something, see if it works, try something else, see if it works. You don't have to worry about the whole game. You don't have to worry about the beginning and ending and all these things. You can just focus on the micro part that you need. And so those tie really well to Kolb's theory of experiential learning. So I'm sorry, that got a little long-winded, but that's the exciting part of that research, and we're pretty fired up about that because we think it speaks bigger.
Yeah, and it's such an exciting opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, actually, and there are a lot of products out there right now. If you think about it, there are one of the people in my classroom is a soccer player on the team, and they wear some vests that give them feedback about how hard they're training and where they're training too hard or too little. Analyze that. That's a way of improving. Or there's ski boots that have sensors in them that can tell you whether or not you're riding, your left edge harder, your right edge harder, or what you're supposed to do. Or actually think about the application Duolingo. That's one of my favorite examples. So Duolingo is an app that people can learn languages on. And most people in the world are using it to learn English. That's their primary audience. But the goal there isn't to translate text. The goal there is for a human to understand, to speak another language. So it's about the human learning. And so they've introduced, for example, new tools to put you in situations to have real-time conversations with AI agents. And that's a really fascinating way. And again, the goal there is for us to be better, not to make the machine better. That's very exciting.
Super exciting. By the way, I've tried Duolingo to learn Spanish. I mean, I didn't go very far, but I know what you're speaking about. It's so popular for a reason.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, no, I
effective.
think it's exciting. And the other thing, and I'll speak to a bigger picture here. I don't want to make a commercial plug for Duolingo, although I mean I like the product. But what's interesting to me is that if you think about a language teacher, a human language teacher, they may go 30 years. Each year they have 100 students. So they have a total of, let's say, I don't know, I should check my math, 3,000 experiences about people learning. Duolingo gets 3,000 experiences just like every 5 seconds. I mean, and so with that, they can observe how people learn. And so we can learn collectively how people learn better in a way, in observing that in a way we've never had access to before. And I'm super excited about that, because if we can understand how we as humans learn better, then we can learn better. And having that massive data about learning processes is really interesting to me. I don't know what we're going to come up with, but if it's in the data, I think we'll figure it out. And I think we're a long way from the Matrix, where you lay down on the chair and you get karate downloaded to your brain. But I do think that we can be much better than we can take, for example, the best learning techniques from wherever someone invents a new learning technique, and suddenly we can all benefit from it. And that diffusion, that way of spreading our ability to learn, I think is huge.
I can't wait to read your paper when it comes out. Super, super excited. Thank you so much
Well,
for sharing.
like all academic papers, we're working on it. It takes forever, but we'll see.
So I'm going to come to, a rather sensitive topic. The moment the conversation moves to AI, as you said right at the start, there is one reaction that it's going to solve all our problems. And then there's the other almost fear-led response of what is this going to mean for us as human beings, or in the context of organizations, what is it going to mean for work? What's it going to mean for jobs? Wondering what your views or thoughts are on that.
No, I get that. There's always a distinction between whether it's your job or my job. Like when technology starts to take over your job, it's fascinating and the productivity gains are amazing. But when it's talking about my job, then I get a little more hesitant about it. But I think one of the things that so many people are thinking about now is not so much job replacement, but thinking about task replacement. So let's start there. I think it's very unlikely that there are entire jobs that will be eliminated because of the technology, particularly in the short term. Now, that doesn't mean the components of the technology of the jobs won't change. Different tasks within the jobs won't change, as they have for years and years. We used to, for example, type a memo, and now we send an email. So I mean, the technology has allowed us to make some changes in the workplace, and I think many of those are better. Now, just because it's going to do task level, it could be that some jobs have more of their tasks taken over than other jobs, and I think that's a real worry. And I have to say, I personally think about it as well. I go into a classroom and I teach 35, 40 students, and I'm thinking machines can do a lot of that for me. Now, so then what I have to do is I have to think about, what is it that I can uniquely offer that the machine can't? And so I think the fear of short-term replacement of a job is probably ill-founded, but that doesn't mean there's no fears or there's no valid concern. So one might be that someone else learns to use this technology better than I do, and then they take my job. So let's say you and I are trying for the same job, and you're better at using AI and you're more productive. Every hour that you spend, you get twice as much done as I do because I'm not using the technology. well, I'm going to hire you every single time. All right. So that's a way that AI didn't take over my job, but I still was affected by the changes in technology. And then maybe a bigger one is, let's say your organization doesn't use AI at all, and my organization does. Well, my cost structure changes. I get cheaper. I get more productive, and suddenly your entire organization is gone. Even though your particular job may not have been affected, the entirety of your organization got wiped out. And so, again, when we talk about individual job replacement, the idea that a humanoid comes in and sits in as a teacher, I think is not short term, but that doesn't mean that there are not workplace implications of all this. So, not to frighten people, but also not to say, oh, it's all going to be okay no matter what. It's
That's
tough.
a very nuanced response, and thank you so much for that, Sam. Scott Galloway, he
Mm-hmm.
wrote in Feb in his newsletter, No Mercy, No Malice. Um,
Mm-hmm.
he said something about how he'd been observing the earning calls for some of the most big names,
Mm-hmm.
technology and e-commerce companies, and his observation was that what people aren't speaking about is why these companies, which are on such a sharp growth trajectory, are actually not hiring as much. And his own, his idea was that that's because um, AI sort of systems are expected to do part of the jobs that, the tasks as you spoke about, that
Mm-hmm.
would ordinarily, they would have needed to hire humans for. So he spoke about how this is a secret that nobody's speaking of. And apparently, one of the big banks spoke about it and then in their earnings call and then quickly had to, issue a clarification that AI is not going to take jobs. But that's actually what it meant, that,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not a surprise because I know that in some of the front runner organizations who we are interviewing, I know one leader spoke to me and he said, today when we start a project, the first thing I ask is how much of this project can we use AI for? Of course, it's a perfectly valid question. And as you said, it's not that it directly means that a humanoid is going to be sitting, as someone may visualize, but it does mean that, they're going to be hiring fewer people because that's the starting point. What of these different tasks can we use AI for? And as you said, it changes cost structures, it changes efficiency levels, and therefore it changes the entire dynamic, right from, as you said, who's going to be a suitable human in that team, obviously someone who can work well with technology and understands enough of it, as well as what is it going to do to competition which is not using. So I,
Mm-hmm.
I I love your explanation because it just makes so much sense. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. The crux of your statement is that, well, before they hired 10 people, now they can do the same amount of human leftover work for 9 people. And there's one, even though no individual job was lost, there's one fewer, need for a human there. And, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing here is a fixed cost, variable cost trade. So human labor is typically a variable cost. You have to pay people every hour that they're there, whether they're hourly or salary doesn't matter, but it's strictly tied to the amount of effort. And what's so appealing to organizations is the idea that they can switch some of that to make it a super low variable cost
Yeah.
for the investment of a fixed cost. Now, I don't think we should trivialize these fixed costs. These fixed costs can be very large to do some of these tasks, but depending on how many jobs they get spread across, it can pay off for organizations. And it's tough. But I don't want to take there's a flaw in this logic, but let me go down this path for a second. You know,
Sure, sure.
the argument is that historically, whenever some new technologies have come along, there have always been new jobs created. And so, we had the Industrial Revolution, and so many jobs that were industrial jobs got reduced or taken over, but plenty of new computer jobs or other jobs came up. And so then there's a certain comfort that says, well, historically, whenever we've introduced technologies, then we've always figured out new things to do. I'm a little worried about that because there's a little bit of survivor bias in that. I mean, just because it's always worked out historically doesn't mean that it's always going to work out in the future. I mean, I think, talk to your friends, the horses, about that and see what they think. They were, instrumental to the economy up until suddenly they weren't. And well, are we the next generation of horses? I'm hoping not, but past does not guarantee the future.
I agree. And, I think, because this is my perhaps pretty flawed view, that the kind of jobs that will be created will be different. So what will change is here and what will get created is here. And I know, in one of your podcast episodes where you interviewed someone who's an actor as well as has an AI studio as well.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of how, in a sense, the democratization of many of the tools which earlier would have belonged to only big budget movie makers are now accessible. So there's that whole basket of new roles that is possible because of that. So, but that doesn't. So it's happening in a different place, right? The creation of these new jobs is happening in a different place, whereas the substitution of at least tasks to start off with technology is happening in a different space. So,
exactly,
it's going to be
a big deal.
Yeah.
So you're referring to Ty Sheridan. Ty Sheridan,
yes.
He was the star of the Ready Player One movie and some other movies, but Ready Player One is the one I liked a lot. And we talked to him, and it was fun to talk to him because he's a fascinating person. But he's trying to come up with a way for small budget films to make big budget special effects. And it doesn't necessarily take away the jobs of the big budget special effects people, but it takes away parts of them or uses parts of them or changes the ecosystem. And so when we think at the macro level that, well, we'll create jobs and we'll lose jobs, even if they balance out, it doesn't mean that the effect on an individual person who lost their job is even. It may be tragic for those individual people who lose jobs. And I think that's what's challenging in general about this, is that even if it ended up sort of in aggregate the same, at an individual level, there can be some significant effects.
Actually, I'm going to I love what you said, and I'm just going to highlight it, that it changes the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very big one. It changes the ecosystem, and it means that anytime that changes, there'll be gains in some quarters, there'll be losses in other quarters. And, whether they even out or they don't, time will tell. But it's impossible to, deny that it's going to happen.
Right. And these things are very hard to predict because they affect, like you said, it's an ecosystem and it's so many different pieces. And each one of those pieces, the invisible hand of the economy is moving around and shifting things. And that we don't know exactly how that invisible hand is going to work out.
Thank you so much, Sam. I've had such a fun time speaking with you. It's been delightful to speak with someone who is so passionate about the topic of AI and culture and organizational learning. There's just so much that I'm taking away, and I'm hoping our viewers do as well. Sam's spoken so much about, some of his most interesting ideas are on how artificial intelligence and the use of those platforms, in fact, changes your organization culture. And then, of course, he spoke about how we can use AI and AI tools to become better learners ourselves by using them to, learn in many different ways, which perhaps wasn't possible earlier. And his observation that use of AI technologies within organizations may not mean a direct, loss in a more traditional way just as yet, but the losses will happen as a result of some amount of substitution of tasks, some amount of changing of the competitive landscape as cost structures themselves change, and of course then a shift in the way the ecosystem itself operates. There's just so many insights there. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's great fun. I'm glad I can talk about this for hours, and I'm curious to follow up with you about some of the work you're doing. And I'm sure I've said some things today that people disagree with, and I like that. If people disagree, feel free to reach out and I am not hard to find with the name Ransbotham. So just just Google me and tell me what you think that's different. I'm really curious.
And I'm gonna link your LinkedIn page in the comments section.
Sure.
So if anyone wants to ask Sam a question directly, please go there and ask your question, and I'll help maybe take your comment, your observation, and your question to Sam.
Sounds
So with
good.
that, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and
Of
stay
course.
tuned for episode
All
62.
right. Thank you for having me. It was great fun.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I really did. I'll tell you three areas where I personally thought, some super interesting ideas were discussed. One, the fact that if you do a good AI implementation, then it's not just the team's morale that increases, but culturally the organization benefits. And it seems to benefit because the ease of doing work becomes, so much better. So that's such an interesting finding that AI would in fact impact culture. And it's like the other side of it. We are studying how culture impacts the AI implementation. Sam's work with BCG studies the impact of AI implementation on culture. So that was super interesting. I also love the work that he's doing on how understanding how AI tools learn actually will help humans learn better. And that's such an interesting and refreshing take on it, right? That now we can study how a technology works to understand better how we ourselves think and can learn better. And of course, I absolutely loved the conversation on AI and jobs because it was so nuanced. So he spoke about how tasks are getting substituted first, then how people who are comfortable with AI tools become front runners for roles compared to those who aren't. And that's a reality we're all living in. And then finally, that organizations who use AI just become that much more competitive and much more likely to succeed. So there's that piece happening. And of course, the other reality which I spoke about in the podcast, that because of the democratization of AI tools, what we're seeing is that there are a whole lot of new, perhaps potential entrepreneurs, small businesses who can be successful. But if you're a larger organization, that sort of advantage that you had earlier, um, because of cost, the things you could afford, has shifted. So there is a whole ecosystem reconfiguration that is already happening and perhaps going to accelerate far more over the next few years. So I hope you really enjoyed our conversation and will join us for future podcasts on AI and culture. Um, Jaspreet and I are really researching companies that are ahead of the curve and coming up with some really interesting findings. In other work that Uncube does, Papia Banerjee, my co-founder, and I are working with leaders in different organizations to help them become more ready to face a very different world from a world that they had entered. So whether you're, a large traditional organization who has been successful over a period of time, or you're an organization that needs to be cutting edge in its area because the nature of roles itself is shifting, do reach out to us, and we will help leaders get a sense of what these shifts mean for them. So with that, thank you very much and have a lovely day ahead.